To our advertised schedule, we've now got Euros highlights in just over an hour on ITV after the latest from a busy day in tonight's news.
Starmer's seismic moment delivered to Downing Street on a Labour landslide.
You must be utterly exhausted.
First, a royal appointment. The new Prime Minister ending 14 years of Tory rule. Then a rapturous welcome to number 10, but sober words about the task ahead.
Our country has voted decisively for change, for national renewal and a return of politics to public service.
For Sunak, only sorrow, a man and his party humiliated by the worst Tory losses in history.
To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
Before we knew it, the new Prime Minister was at work shaping his new government, a procession of new ministers filing into the door behind us. Also making history, Rachel Reeves, the first ever female Chancellor, Angela Rayner, Deputy Prime Minister, and David Lammy as Foreign Secretary. Also tonight. Dancing their way to their best result ever, the Lib Dems celebrate their part in the Tory downfall. Farage, finally elected with 4 others from Reform UK, promises to take the fight to Labour.
We will now be targeting Labour votes. We're coming for Labour, be in no doubt about that.
And a rout for the SNP, left with just 9 seats. Does this see off the bid for Scottish independence for a generation?
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham in Downing Street.
Well, good evening from Downing Street, where the new Prime Minister wasted no time in assembling a new cabinet to begin what he called the work of change. Sir Keir Starmer's Labour won the biggest majority for a generation, 174 seats. He stood in the street here this afternoon and spoke of the country needing a reset for everyone, not just those who voted Labour. For the Conservatives, it was their worst result on record. Rishi Sunak responded to what he called the public's anger and disappointment, announcing he would step down as Conservative leader. "I am sorry," he said, "and I take responsibility." The biggest symbolic defeat was that of former Prime Minister Liz Truss. The Lib Dems and Reform UK took thousands of votes off the Conservatives. The Lib Dems got 71 seats, Reform UK 5, including Nigel Farage. But it was Labour triumph after 14 years of waiting. Even the rain held off, for Sir Keir anyway.
Bring out the flags for the arrival of new tenants at 10 Downing Street, after one of the most dramatic and important nights in British election history. She definitely didn't want to miss it. And there he is, Britain's new Prime Minister, thanking campaigners and friends who helped Keir Starmer turn a modest increase in Labour's share of the vote into a spectacular majority in the House of Commons.
I have just returned from Buckingham Palace, where I accepted an invitation from His Majesty the King to form the next government of this great nation. If you voted Labour yesterday, we will carry the responsibility of your trust as we rebuild our country. But whether you voted Labour or not, in fact, especially if you did not, I say to you directly, my government will serve you. Politics can be a force for good. We will show that. And it is surely clear to everyone that our country needs a bigger reset, a rediscovery of who we are. For too long now, we've turned a blind eye as millions slid into greater insecurity. Nurses, builders, drivers, carers, people doing the right thing, working harder every day, recognised at moments like this before, yet as soon as the cameras stop rolling, their lives are ignored. I want to say very clearly to those people, not this time.
His time up. Unlike when he took the gamble of his life by calling the election, only a light drizzle, though his wife Akshata, clutching an umbrella, taking no chances.
I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters. I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss. One of the most remarkable things about Britain is just how unremarkable it is that 2 generations after my grandparents came here with little, I could become Prime Minister, and that I could watch my 2 young daughters light Diwali candles on the steps in Downing Street. We must hold true to that idea of who we are, that vision of kindness, decency, and tolerance that has always been the British way. This is a difficult day, at the end of a number of difficult days. But I leave this job honoured to have been your Prime Minister.
There are no prizes in politics for coming second. And by the time Rishi Sunak knew he'd won his own Yorkshire seat, he was losing colleagues left, centre and right. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, out. Penny Mordaunt, her hopes of being leader, dashed.
Tonight, the Conservative Party has taken a battering because it failed to honour the trust that people had placed in it.
And then, perhaps the most powerful moment of them all, Rishi Sunak's predecessor as Prime Minister for 7 tumultuous weeks, Liz Truss, rejected by voters in a seat that was supposed to be rock-solid Tory.
Truss, Liz, the Conservative Party candidate, 11,217.
Well done. Thank you.
But if Labour's victory is the big story, Nigel Farage's success in becoming an MP at the 8th attempt came a close second because the Reform Party he only recently decided to lead gathered 4 million votes, many of them from former Tory voters. And now he has a new target.
This Labour government will be in trouble very, very quickly. We will now be targeting Labour votes. We're coming for Labour, be in no doubt about that.
Reform got just 5 MPs. But Ed Davey, whose campaign was like an extended version of It's a Knockout with his bungee jumps and wobbly paddleboarding, led the Lib Dems to a harvest of more than 70 seats.
You have helped us get our best results for over 100 years.
Bristol, you made history.
Yes!
The Greens also had a breakthrough, winning 4 seats. But the Scottish National Party was humiliated, losing 4/5 of their MPs.
We need to learn some hard lessons from tonight, and I'm committed to doing exactly that.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Remember him? Jeremy Corbyn was Labour's leader at the last election. But Keir Starmer threw him out in a purge of anti-Semitism. Corbyn broke the habits of a half-century in politics. He ran against Labour and won.
This result is, to me, a resounding message from the people of Islington North that they want something different, they want something better.
But nothing could spoil Labour's and Starmer's party. At the Tate Modern in central London, a kiss for Vic, his wife, who said when she first met him, "Who does he think he is?" Well, he's the bloke who went to the palace for the ceremony of kissing hands, his formal anointing as Prime Minister.
Sir Keir Starmer, Your Majesty.
Your Majesty. You must be utterly exhausted. And having to get to grips with everything straight away. It must be quite exhausting.
They look as though they can't quite believe it. And who could blame them? There's never been quite such a political comeback from the kind of defeat Labour suffered in the last general election. But now's for the really hard bit. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Well, Labour's majority speaks for itself. Behind that headline figure of 174, the votes on which that is based show some fascinating undercurrents. For example, Labour had a smaller share of the vote than Boris Johnson did in 2019, and Reform got 500,000 more votes than the Lib Dems, but only 5 seats compared to their 71. Anushka has been curating and crunching the numbers. Anushka.
Thanks, Julie. There is just one more seat to count, so let's take a look at that result. This was the political map in 2019, dominated by Boris Johnson, dominated by the Conservatives with that 80-seat majority. This is it today. A totally reshaped map, and there are those eye-watering numbers. 412 for Labour, 121 for the Conservatives, 71 for the Lib Dems, and the SNP down to 9. There were signs of disillusionment. Turnout was just 61%. And Starmer's landslide victory was delivered by just 1 in 3 voters backing his party, 33.8% vote share. Jeremy Corbyn lost with just 262 seats on 40% in 2017. So what's going on? Well, 2 things. Firstly, Labour's vote is more efficient. Corbyn arguably piled up too many votes in Labour's safer seats. While Labour lost support in those seats last night, this shows their vote share was down. But it was up in Conservative-held seats they were targeting. So they more effectively spread out their vote to increase it in the places they needed to win seats. But there is another big part of this story, and you can see it here. The vote for Reform UK was up all over the place, and Nigel Farage's party came second in almost 100 seats, which we think damaged the Conservatives most of all and seems to have helped Labour come through the middle in key seats like Suffolk Coastal. A big political figure, Therese Coffey, out last night, but by a tiny margin and much less than the Reform vote in her seat. So a big Reform impact, but Nigel Farage might not love our voting system today. His party only got 5 seats on the back of 4.1 million votes. The Lib Dems, with tactical voting and a lot of pretty impressive targeting, got 71 seats on 3.5 million. The Greens got 4 seats on 1.9 million. So, look, a big win for Labour overall, but a complicated story under the surface.
Yeah, and a fascinating one too. Anushka, thanks very much indeed for that. Well, on a day of seismic political change, what didn't change was the allocation of jobs from shadow to full cabinet members. After Keir Starmer himself, the next 3 most important jobs went to women, as expected. Rachel Reeves, the first female Chancellor, Angela Rayner, Deputy Leader, and Yvette Cooper, the new Home Secretary.
Rachel Reeves arrived in Downing Street today to become not only the new woman at the Treasury, but the first woman ever to run the Exchequer in its 800-year history. After meeting the Prime Minister, she walked out of her new front door.
Congratulations, Chancellor. How does it feel to make history?
Pretty good, she said, as she marched into the Treasury for the traditional welcome from civil servants. She told them she wanted to be the most pro-growth Chancellor in history, and
it is also a huge privilege to be the first ever female Chancellor of the Exchequer. To every young woman and girl, watching this, let today show that there should be no ceilings on your ambitions, your hopes or your dreams.
Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader, has also now been appointed Deputy Prime Minister.
Angela, how many jobs have you got?
Well, she is also Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. And arriving at the Home Office, veteran of the Blair-Brown years, Yvette Cooper. She has twice been Shadow Home Secretary.
Congratulations, Home Secretary.
Thank you very much.
It's been a long time coming for you.
Okay. Well, look, it's a real honour to be asked by Keir Starmer to serve as the new Home Secretary. The first duty of any government is to keep our country safe, to keep our communities safe and to keep our borders secure.
But not all of Labour's shadow team made it to Downing Street. Jonathan Ashworth lost his seat last night.
It's very disappointing, but that's democracy. That's democracy.
And so did Thangham Debonair, the shadow culture secretary. And so today, Lisa Nandy found herself appointed Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. This afternoon, the new Health Secretary said he had already started work.
Today, one of my very first calls was to the junior doctors, inviting them in next week to get the negotiations up and running as a matter of urgency.
Today, Labour's new ministers can savour their historic victory. Tomorrow, they have some very familiar problems to solve. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, Rachel Reeves, who we saw there in Carl's report, faces the toughest of challenges now, getting to grip with the economy and deciding what to do in her first budget, whenever that is. Joel Laurie, economics editor, joins me now. So a chance now to properly look under the bonnet, decide when that budget might be. And given that they built everything on this promise of growth, it is one heck of a challenge.
Yeah, hopefully they'll get lucky, Julie. I mean, outgoing ministers occasionally leave handover notes, don't they, for their successors? You'll remember back in 2010, Liam Byrne wrote, "There's no money left, I'm afraid." I think it's interesting that back then he felt able to joke about the public finances in the way that it's deadly serious today. National debt has risen to its highest level in 70 years. Higher interest rates mean servicing that debt is much more expensive. Tax revenues rose at a record rate in the last Parliament. Public services are visibly under strain. And the outlook for economic growth, as you say, is unspectacular at best. Now, Labour says it's going to kickstart growth. Fair enough. It's set out the plan, roughly how it's going to do that. We need a lot more detail, by the way, particularly when it comes to things like planning reform. But Keir Starmer, Julie, is hoping to get that the economy grow 2.5% every year during this Parliament. If it does, a lot of Labour's headaches disappear. If it doesn't, and the chances are it won't, then Labour's going to have to find billions of pounds from somewhere or to avoid cuts to investment, spending on unprotected public services. Where's this money going to come from? Where might the axe fall? Labour spent the entire election campaign studiously avoiding answering any of those questions. It did make some eye-catching promises: get debt falling, no increases for taxes for working people, and no return to austerity. Keeping all three of those promises is going to be really difficult.
OK, Joel, thank you very much indeed for that, under your own personal umbrella. Lucky chap. So far, Sir Keir Starmer has been as good as his word on getting down to business. Cabinet appointed, tick. First cabinet meeting arranged for tomorrow, Saturday, tick. Paul is in the studio to explain why all the hurry.
Yeah, Julie, Keir Starmer said this morning, our work is urgent and we begin it today, and he has no choice given the in-tray, including what we've just been hearing there from Joel. Let's take three of the top concerns. Firstly, as Joel was talking about, the economy. Preparations begin from now for a September budget in which Labour is promising, somewhat ambitiously, to grow the economy, to avoid spending cuts or tax rises. And one of the first set of policies we're going to see in the weeks and months ahead is planning reform and house building. Economic growth is, of course, how Labour hope to fix public services like the NHS. One of the first things they're promising on that front is to provide an extra 40,000 appointments, scans and operations each week. But to get there, as we've already heard, they'll have to sit down with junior doctors to try to achieve what the Conservatives couldn't and end those strikes. And then, of course, there's immigration. We know Labour will immediately scrap the Rwanda scheme. Those flights are not taking off. Their alternative answer is to try and tackle the smuggling gangs when it comes to those small boat crossings, but that part is much easier said than done. Other challenges, certainly worth mentioning, away from the big three, include Labour's crackdown, its plan on private school tuition fees and the VAT that it's going to put on those, setting up a battle with some parents and head teachers ahead of next September. There'll be some difficult conversations with businesses too about reforms to workers' rights, which will be unveiled in the King's speech later this month. And one of the big stories last night, Labour is going to to face real difficulties over its policy on the war in Gaza, with the election of that handful of independent candidates holding Keir Starmer's feet to the fire, possibly the most uncomfortable policy area for Labour in the immediate weeks and months ahead. There will be no easing into the job for this Prime Minister, Julie.
Indeed not, Paul. Thank you. Well, for a guide to some of the key issues the new Labour government has to deal with, just head to our website. In the general election policy section, our team take a look at immigration, the economy and, of course, waiting lists. Now, many reasons have been offered for the Conservatives' dire performance. All, no doubt, will be fed into the process of choosing that new leader. The woman blamed by many, even within her own party, Liz Truss, for the downturn in Conservative fortunes, was driven out, as we saw a moment ago, in her own constituency. So, a former Prime Minister dumped. Also strong-armed out by Labour, Penny Mordaunt. So too the now former Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps. Another leaving the job, former Education Secretary Gillian Keegan, and former Cabinet Minister Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Rishi Sunak hand in hand with his wife leaving Downing Street and frontline politics. A personal crossroads for him, for his party, a looming decision about which way they now turn and who will take them there. It's Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, who kept his seat but lost his job and gave every appearance of being delighted to be heading out of number 11, appealed for his colleagues to take time to take stock.
I think we now have to take our time, to have a period of reflection, and we need to have the honesty, humility and courage to ask ourselves why we have lost the trust of the British people.
But even before all the results were in overnight, the blame game began. Suella Braverman first up.
The Conservative Party has let you down. You, the great British people, voted for us over 14 years, and we did not keep our promises.
She among those on the right of the party who think the way to counter Reform's new power is to embrace Nigel Farage.
There will be a huge conversation and argument inside the Conservative Party, which is if we can merge with Reform, then we can come back at Labour. Labour didn't get such a high share of the vote. If the majority is thinner than it looks on paper, I think that's a disastrous route for the Tories to go down.
How that will play out in the coming weeks is partly down to who's survived to contest the leadership. On the centre of the party, Tom Tugendhat, Victoria Atkins and James Cleverly all kept their seats. On the party's right, as well as Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch are likely to be among those fighting it out.
The Conservative Party seems to be engaged in a battle for its soul now. I mean, which side do you think will win out?
You don't go from that huge victory we had in 2019 to this huge defeat we just suffered without realising that nearly everyone in the party's got something wrong. We were catastrophically incompetent in various ways.
The party that's dominated Parliament and politics for so long has some difficult truths to face and turbulent times ahead. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
And Robert joins me now to contemplate really what we've witnessed and experienced in the last 24 hours. And I've seen what we've witnessed partly described as a loveless landslide, a wide success for Sir Keir Starmer, but potentially a shallow one. There are a lot of challenges politically as well as economically. He's got to restore trust. He knows you've got a wearied electorate.
So the big story of the night was the rejection of the Tories, but in general, a sort of collective despair with politics, as Anushka pointed out. The proportion of people who voted down at 60%, and I think only once has the vote share been lower than that. So Labour has been sort of, Keir Starmer has been carried sort of shoulder high into 10 Downing Street, sort of on a wave of apathy, and actually to an extent worse than that, the people, the 4.1 million people who voted for Reform are just furious with the existing parties. He's benefited from that, but he knows, he sort of implied when he came out to talk to all of us, he knows that that could ultimately damage him, because these millions of people who are either protesting through a vote for a party like Reform or not voting, they feel that government has let them down. Their living standards have been stagnating for years and years and years. We saw one manifestation of that discontent in that vote to leave the European Union. For those people, voting that the European Union hasn't fixed their problem. So this is another wave of protest, which is why Keir Starmer came out tonight and said probably his biggest priority is to rebuild trust between his government, I think he was really saying all politicians as far as he can, and voters, because if we don't do that, we may well end up, in the sort of kind of chaotic politics we've seen in America with Trump, and the kind of, rise of what some people would regard as an extreme right-wing party that we've seen in France.
OK, we will come back to you a bit later on in the programme on this momentous evening. Thanks for the moment, Robert, for that. Well, as we've seen from the voting figures, the election result was as much about defeating the Conservatives, as Robert was just saying, as backing Labour. The Conservatives lost 4 seats held by former Conservative Prime Ministers Lord Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson and, most notably, of course, Liz Truss. A few examples of why it was the Conservatives' worst election defeat.
The true blue seats of these former Conservative Prime Ministers have all changed colour. But for areas like this to switch to Labour is big news, especially when it involves ex-PM Liz Truss losing her seat.
Oh, did she really? Hooray!
I wouldn't have picked her if she was the last lettuce in the field.
Gideon, who's lived here for 14 years, has switched his vote for the first time over broken promises on Brexit and immigration.
You're sad to see her go?
Yeah, but I didn't vote for her.
Oh, now I know.
Now the truth's coming out.
Now the truth's coming out.
Would you like to tell us who you voted?
Reform. And I thought long and hard, because I knew a vote for them was a vote for Labour.
And we've got quite a few things going on in here. We've got some of our goats kidding at the moment.
Daniel believes farmers here are also turning their backs on the Tories. As a dad of 2, one with special needs, he says the Conservatives have made a mess of government.
But I just think a lot of the broken promises and the worry after Brexit and being told we are going to help you, don't panic, don't worry, we know this is we weren't expecting this, but we're going to look after you, and it just never came, it never happened.
What about mortgage rates?
Yes, I mean, I have a mortgage. When I put it in a calculator, what my mortgage would go up to if my term ended now, I mean, yeah, I'd be at least £200, £300 a month down, probably, and that is actually people's money for things like Church Farm coming for a day out.
Back in town, we bumped into Marie, who was homeless a few years ago. She voted Labour.
Liz Truss, what do you make of her?
There's a few times I've wrote to her, but she's never really kind of got back to me.
What did you write to her about?
It was actually to do with the NHS dentist.
At one time, just being a former Prime Minister in a safe seat would have been enough to win for the Tories. But this time, they've taken a real beating. Stacey Foster, News at 10, South West Norfolk.
Well, for the Liberal Democrats, last night's results were the best for more than a century. They had 15 seats before the election was called. Today, they've been celebrating winning 71. That takes them back to being the third biggest party in Parliament, and by some margin, a vindication for Sir Ed Davy's colourful and well-targeted local campaigning.
Just when you thought you'd seen it all from Sir Ed Davy, it turns out he had one more surprise up his sleeve. It was dawn outside when he danced, delighted, into his own party, knowing he had just pulled off his greatest stunt yet.
What a night to be a Liberal Democrat.
9 years after a near wipeout at the 2015 election, last night the party won more seats than it's ever had in its history.
Been a long road with plenty of twists and turns, but we stuck to it. And tonight is our reward.
We've been following Ed Davey and the Lib Dems campaign for the past 6 weeks. They told us
They felt they knew it had gone well, but I don't think any of them dared to dream that they'd win this many seats.
Come on, my sweetheart.
Sir Ed put health and social care at the heart of his campaign, speaking candidly about his own experience of caring for his son John. But for every serious message, there was a silly stunt. He focused a lot of his energy on winning back former Lib Dem heartlands across the southwest. But they also gained new ground last night, in places like Oxfordshire, including in Boris Johnson's old seat, Henley and Tame.
Quite honestly, I've had more things through my door about the Lib Dems than I have about Conservatives.
Time for a fresh start or a change. I think there's a lot of local issues which need addressing, so yeah, I'm quite pleased.
Ed Davey was the only politician during this campaign who really looked like he was having fun. Whether voters liked him or simply disliked the Tories.
Here we go.
There's no question that he has manoeuvred his party back into a position of real influence. Chloe Keedy, News at 10.
Well, Reform UK collected 4 million votes, although only have those 5 MPs to show for it. Most votes came at the expense of the Conservatives, of course, but a triumphant Nigel Farage told us they would have had even more support were it not for the unacceptable racist remarks, as he described them, of a few of their candidates.
When Nigel Farage decided to enter this election, this is the result he was dreaming of.
Did you get much sleep?
And when I spoke to the Reform leader and one of his new MPs today, he said it was just the start.
What are you going to do? How are you going to work in this Parliament?
We're going to rely on him because he's been there before. He's chief whip. I haven't asked him yet, but he is.
Let's be honest, though. The Labour Party are going to be absolutely terrified. We're the only people, really, in Westminster that can hold the government to account.
But not long after his arrival in Westminster,
We need people who are going to bring unity, not division!
no fewer than 7 protesters disrupted his attempts to celebrate.
Any more for any more? Actually, yes!
Nigel Farage told me racist and offensive remarks by some of his candidates had cost his Reform Party votes.
We clearly had a situation where a Charlie call was put out, please anyone that can stand, stand. So of course we've got, some people that shouldn't be there.
But what about this man, George Jones, a close aide kicked out the campaign last week after homophobic comments.
You see that degenerate flag on the front bonnet? What the old Bill doing promoting that crap?
Last night we spotted him celebrating with Nigel Farage in Clacton.
You kicked him out, and then a week later, he's back partying, celebrating you. People will say, you didn't actually take that seriously.
We've taken it very seriously. I had no idea he was going to be there, but he's there because there's a group of people that he was working with.
But he's not going to work for you in future.
No.
This morning, voters in Ashfield became the first to ever elect a Reform MP.
I think we need something new, because no matter, it's only a two-way vote all the time. It's either Conservatives or Labour.
I voted for Lee Anderson. Not so much for Lee Anderson, but for Nigel Farage.
It's time he gets a break and to prove to people what he can do.
This evening, a 5th Reform MP was elected in Basildon. Nigel Farage hopes many more will join him in the years to come. Harry Horton, News at 10.
Well, the most eye-catching of the Green Party's victories, increasing their number of MPs from 1 to 4, was by co-leader Carla Denyer. She won Bristol Central from Labour. She defeated the woman who is supposed to become Labour's new Culture Secretary, Thangham Debonair. Miss Denyer promised Green MPs would push the Labour government to be braver about tackling climate change and sewage, as well as housing and taxes. Well, the collapse of support for the Scottish National Party was summed up by its leader, First Minister John Swinney, as an incredibly tough night after what he called a difficult period for the SNP. For that, read Nicola Sturgeon's fall from grace and 3 different leaders in just over a year. He said his party had failed to convince voters of the urgent need for independence, which remains broadly popular. Labour reaped the rewards. In the 2019 election, the SNP won 48 of the 59 seats. Labour had 1. This time, the SNP won just 9 while Labour has risen from that single MP to 37.
Sometimes just a look says it all.
We missed some big opportunities.
The SNP's decade of dominance was coming to an end in front of Nicola Sturgeon's eyes, and party colleagues had blame for her role in what went so terribly wrong.
And a lack of discussion over policy and strategy in the party under both Nicola's leadership and under Ian Blackford's leadership at Westminster.
Nicola Sturgeon is still a sitting MSP for the SNP, but notably her own critique referred to her party as they and them, distancing herself from what she said were strategic failures.
They've kind of left themselves between two stools on the independence question. If you're going to put independence at the heart of the campaign, which putting it on the line 1, page 1 of the manifesto arguably does, then to make that an effective strategy, or to try to make that an effective strategy, you've got to follow it through into the day-to-day campaigning. That's the bit I don't think the SNP...
So it's a setback because your successors failed.
Morning. Not a good morning for the current leader then. Overnight, the SNP were wiped out completely in Edinburgh and Glasgow, their seat count reduced to single figures.
Last night was an incredibly tough night for the Scottish National Party.
The SNP had said independence was on the ballot paper in this election, but on that point, they were still not prepared to concede defeat.
My view about independence, Peter, hasn't changed. It's not changed this morning as a consequence of this election campaign.
In this election, you have lost, and it's the manner in which you've lost, the scale of this defeat. Surely you can take independence off the table, at least for the next Westminster parliamentary term.
There are democratic choices to be made, and I think people should be allowed to do so. And we have to take, and we have to take our time to consider those issues. No, it's not.
Proportionally, the SNP actually suffered heavier losses than the Tories did last night, and yet support for independence remains high. Many just loaned their vote to Labour. Even Nicola Sturgeon's own constituency in the Scottish Parliament is one of the many seats that have now switched from yellow to red in Westminster.
Nicola, I'm really disappointed in her because I had a lot of time for her. So I'm really sad about that. But I'm just happy that the Tories are out.
John Swinney, the SNP leader, says that independence is still not off the table.
He's in cloud cuckoo land.
People are voting them out and it's still on the table. Does he not take any notice of the people?
Independence will not spontaneously disappear, but this election is a tidal change. Labour's relentless red wave has reached Scottish shores and it's left little in its way. Peter Smith, News at 10, Edinburgh.
Well, if the political heat has lowered on another independence referendum in Scotland, demands for a vote on Irish unification have been boosted by Sinn Féin's success in Northern Ireland. For the first time, the Nationalist Party has won the most Westminster seats there, 7 in all. They've beaten the Democratic Unionists into second and say the result shows it is time to prepare a plan with the Westminster government for a new future for Northern Ireland. Neil joins us now from Belfast and talk to us a bit about this Sinn Féin success. They're obviously eyeing this with a potential boost for hopes for a united Ireland, Neil.
Yes, Julie, 18 constituencies were up for grabs last night. As you say, Sinn Féin winning 7 of them, which makes them the largest party returning MPs to Westminster. Of course, they won't take their seats at Westminster because of the party's long-held policy on abstentionism. Of course, they will not swear an allegiance to the Crown in Parliament. Now, let's bear in mind that Sinn Féin are the largest party in Stormont already. They are the largest party when it comes to local government in Northern Ireland. And then we have last night. I think there will be many in Sinn Féin looking at what happened last night as another step on the road towards a poll on Irish unification. There are clearly many other voices here opposed to that, saying there is no need to review or look at the constitutional setup of Northern Ireland. The other big development here last night, Julie, was what happened to the Democratic Unionist Party, which has dominated Northern Irish politics for the last 2 decades. They lost 3 MPs last night, most notably Ian Paisley Jr. in North Antrim, a seat that he has held and his father before him since 1970. So 54 years coming to an end there, and some big questions facing the DUP here over their general election performance.
Neil, thanks very much for that. Well, in Wales, the Conservatives lost all of their seats. Among them was that aide to Rishi Sunak, Craig Williams, who bet on a July election. Labour won 27 of the 32 parliamentary seats in Wales. Plaid Cymru got 4 and the Lib Dems got 1. Well, the new Prime Minister will find himself on the world stage before he knows it. He's due in Washington next week for a NATO summit. President Biden gave Sir Keir Starmer a congratulatory call this afternoon and said he was looking forward to seeing him. Dan is in DC. What more can you tell us about this call? It's one of those moments, isn't it, for a new incoming Prime Minister?
Yeah, along with sort of getting the nuclear codes, I suppose, as well. We got a readout from the White House today saying that of course, they reaffirmed the special relationship, the deepening US-UK cooperation, reiterated their support, mutual support for Ukraine. Interestingly, a mention of the Good Friday Agreement, an issue that Joe Biden is very passionate about. No mention, interestingly, of Gaza, that elusive peace treaty that Joe Biden has been pursuing for months now, wasn't mentioned at all. And that is potentially a thorny area for Prime Minister Keir Starmer, as well as he tries to placate the left of his party and tread a potentially quite difficult line as Prime Minister. But look, next week, as you say, he will be here in DC for his entree onto the international stage. He's not been in DC since he became Labour leader, so he'll get the obligatory photo call with the other leaders of NATO. But the agenda really will be heavily focused on Ukraine, talking about how they can agree on a common way for Ukraine to potentially one day become a member of NATO, but also defence spending as well. The Tories had pledged to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Labour had said all the way along that they'd do it as soon as resources would allow. Well, they're going to come under a lot of pressure, I think, from other NATO members, particularly America, to put their money where their mouth is, as it were, and increase defence spending for the UK.
Dan, thank you very much indeed. Robert's still with me here in this rain-swept Downing Street. Just for a quick final thought, really, Robert, and we shouldn't underestimate the scale of the achievement that Keir Starmer has effected within Labour in such a short space of time to get here tonight.
That's right. He was the smiliest I've ever seen him today. When he's looked at his intro, though, I wonder whether he will still be smiling. I'm just going to highlight three of the massive challenges he faces. First of all, you might say it's the people's priority, fixing the health service. I was struck that Wes Streeting, the new health secretary, said it was the policy of the government that the NHS is bust. I don't think he meant that he wants to make it worse. I think he just meant it's really broken. Second, night after night, we've been talking about this hole in the public finances. Very hard to fix it without putting up taxes, but Keir Starmer has said doesn't want to break the trust of the British people. Putting up taxes might look as though he was breaking manifesto promises. And then this is the least proportional election we have ever had. I mean, for example, Reform get 14% of the votes, 1% of the seats. The Labour Party gets 34% of the votes. Well over 60% of seats. There will be pressure for electoral reform, which he may find hard to resist. And then finally, a personal plea. I wonder if he can fix the Downing Street rain.
We'll leave that on his in tray for tonight. It has been quite the 24 hours, though, Robert, hasn't it? A moment in history which you have taken us through and witnessed.
It's been quite extraordinary. Tonight, Keir Starmer talking to world leaders. The new regime has started in earnest.
OK, Robert, great to talk to you, as ever, even in the pouring rain. Thank you very much indeed. Just time for a preview of the headlines Sir Keir Starmer will be waking up to. The Times shows him with an outstretched arm and quotes him as saying the work of change begins. The Mirror has a similar photo and says he is beginning to rebuild Britain. And the Mail says that after Sir Keir's promises here in Downing Street today, now he has to deliver. And that is just about it on the day Sir Keir Starmer became only the fifth Labour leader to win an election. Keir Starmer said change could only happen if people voted for it, and yesterday they did.
Tonight, the country is on the threshold of a decisive shift, a chapter of change. Voters have chosen that change after 14 years of Conservative government that began with David Cameron's coalition with Nick Clegg's Liberal Democrats. But everything in the garden was not rosy. Austerity was the prescription for the aftermath of the financial crisis. Cameron gambled on Brexit, but the Leavers won, forcing his resignation. The country soon wanted change from Theresa May's failed attempts to get Brexit through Parliament, let alone make a success of it.
When tough times come upon you.
Boris Johnson bulldozed his way to a big majority, pushing Brexit through. In the struggle against COVID, the world-beating vaccination programme gave Britain a booster. But Mr Johnson was haunted by the ghost of Partygate and harried from office, making way for Liz Truss. But her mini-budget proved to be the wrong kind of change.
I'm a fighter and not a quitter.
The clamour grew for an end to Rishi Sunak's tenure in number 10, when inflation did come down, but he still couldn't stop the boats, nor the rain.
And if you don't have a plan, how can you possibly be trusted to lead our country?
This morning, though, the sun rose on a new political age and a new reality in Westminster. The door of Downing Street swung open to a different way of doing things. After 14 years of Tory rule, a powerful Labour Prime Minister with a huge majority and with the levers of change he's longed for now in his hands. Around his cabinet table, his newly appointed ministers will attempt to make good on the commitments we heard about and perhaps some we didn't. The dial has shifted. We all watch and wait. A new era has begun.
And that is it for election 2024. We await to see what happens next. From all of us here, good night.